Hello and welcome to another episode of Hydra's Den. I'm your host Hydra, and today I'm joined by Albert.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, today is a bit of a continuation of our last stream. Last stream we talked a bit about NPC building and sort of like town building on the sort of very small level. Today we're going to be talking more about world building. Uh, the two major kinds, which are going to be big to small and small to big. We'll get more into that in a bit, but first, we'd like to kind of outline a few sort of really important things. So, when I refer to world building, we're talking about one of the most basic things if you're making D&D or making whatever sort of tabletop you're doing as a DM. This is the act of building the world, as the name implies, but it's building everything that your story's going to go on in. You're setting up the playground, you're setting all the little things in play, you're making the map. It sounds like a really easy thing, but it's something you should put some thought into, because just kind of going with whatever comes to mind, just ripping something off of Skyrim, is both a little boring and denies you the fun of actually getting to build stuff yourself. Not to say that you can't use the pre-made ones. There's plenty of good ones out there. Faerun, what are the others? Eberron?
Even just taking those pre-made worlds and just kind of making it your own by spinning it or by smashing it into something else. If you want to do Skyrim meets The Walking Dead meets Stargate kind of mix mash and create something unique out of a lot of already created content, because that's what most ideas and world building is even if you don't do it consciously. There's the idea that there's no original thought, so you'll think of something that you think is yours and very original, only to find out it's a very close similarity to something else and another thing mixed together, which is perfectly okay.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of people will get very caught up on the idea that they didn't make something original and thus it's somehow inferior. It's not. Just because you're doing stuff that's been done before doesn't in any way devalue it. And it's important to remember not to get yourself caught up on that, especially if your players start going out and calling out your stuff over and over again. Oh, you're just remaking this. Just, man, it doesn't matter.
You don't need that negativity.
Exactly. Or you could just, make little things to spite them, or you could take advantage of their expectations and subvert them. It's up to you, but let's talk world building though. First off, there's a few things that we need to sort of outline before we get into what kind of world building we're doing, whether it's big to small or small to big. As I said, we'll get into that in a second. But the first most important things you can do are, I'd say there's kind of like three general categories, which are terrain, your levels of magic, technology, whatever, that type of stuff, and the feel of the game. So basically what that means is, if we start on terrain, what kind of world are we talking here? Are we talking about a federation of planets across a space system? Are we talking about a world filled with water where pirates reign supreme? Are we talking about a desert post-apocalyptic wasteland? It's really, really important, because it defines pretty much everything else around it, much in the same way the other two things do. But it seems like a no-brainer at first, but taking a little bit of time thinking, what am I doing here, is kind of really important.
Yeah, and to come back to that, geography, historically speaking, has probably done more to shape world borders and barriers between kingdoms, more than decisive battles. So mountain ranges, oceans, deep rivers, these are all things naturally determined the borders of one's kingdom or natural expansion area around a nation state.
Yeah, of course. And so whether you make your world by throwing a bunch of macaroni at a piece of paper with glue on it and seeing what sticks,
Which
or
does work.
I've seen it before, yep. Or you actually go into detail considering how the shape of mountains is going to affect rainfall in an area, which will affect erosion, which will affect water flow, etc., etc. Whether you do whatever level you go at, just take some time, think about it. and work from there, or steal a map. Either way, you'll be able to do your own stuff with that map. So just important
Yep.
thing to remember. Second one,
Uh,
no, so that's what I say.
I was gonna chime in there. We'll probably do a separate stream on world building resources, including map making, culture design, things like that. That'll probably be a separate stream
Yeah, that could be
in
fun.
in that vein of uh, world shipping and map designing.
Yeah. So second thing, I called this when I was hashing this out earlier, levels of systems, but that's a really dumb name, and I don't know a good name for this. But basically, it's your level of magic and your level of technology. Um, what is there in this setting? Is this a setting filled with swords and sorcery, or is this a grim space future? Is this a place where it's modern technology, it's medieval? These things are basically, I guess, they're the setting of the game. Are you Lord of the Rings or are you Star Trek? Whether you, no matter whether you're doing this on a really big planet or a really small planet, these are things. These are so important because they affect pretty much everything else around them. People's culture will be shaped by things like whether or not magic is a thing. Do gods exist? Is there a god over there and he's going to beat you up? Oh,
Yeah.
really
How
important.
regionally powerful are gods is an underappreciated part of world building.
Yeah, but just these things will connect your world together. They'll decide how people travel, when people travel, and in general what your players can do within that game. And the third one, probably the most important of these three, though, that we've set out, are what's the feel of the game. Is this a happy game? Is this a sad game? Is this a heroic, or is this a gritty, rough survival game? Whether it's Lord of the Rings, high fantasy, people can take hits that would kill the average man and get back up, shrug them off, keep going. Or if this is a very, very grim Call of Cthulhu-esque thing where even just looking at the horrors will break your mind, that will really determine everything else. It will determine how you make your characters for the players. It will determine how, as GM, you make your players. It will determine everything. Just so many different things depend on this feel of the game. What would you call that?
Probably the tone of the game.
There you go.
So in that respect, you'd have things between two examples I'd use would be a very gritty. You're a nobody, but you're trying to make your way in the world. Is a very Warhammer Fantasy style RPG system where you could start off as literally a farmer, walk down the street, and have a leg cut off, and then have to play the game like that. And you're basically rolling more characters than you'd probably like to admit because they're so fragile and non-heroic. Or you have like your Dungeons and Dragons, your Eberron, you have your heroic style gaming where you can get shot by a harpoon and then take a long rest for 8 hours and then pull it out and be at perfect health again.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even the GOPD games I run are sort of a weird middle ground. I would call it the cinematic middle ground, where people die to anything, to the slightest errant shotgun blast to the face, unless it would be really cool if they didn't. So it's the kind of how you set things up. I mean, the reason why is because at the end of the day, my GOPD games are about the players being heroes. They're being action heroes, so things have real threats, but players are expected.
You can't always get shot in the leg and then basically be a drag the rest of the game. You have to have some level of sensationalism and
Exactly.
yeah.
So from there, we're gonna move into the specifics of big to small versus small to big. These are generally considered two of the major ways when you're to work things out when you're building a world, and what it refers to is I'd call it and you can correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Albert.
Yep.
But the idea that either you start on the very big scale of the world, you chart out the major powers, the major feeling of the world itself, and then you zoom in a bit more onto the specific area that they're working in, and then you move in more, and then you keep moving inwards. and basically you work with the larger things that you've built to factor in onto all of the other stuff. So let's just say you work on the huge amount of climate and all these things about the people and all the major cultures and races and everything, and then you factor that into how you're working on this little space that the players find themselves in.
Yeah.
um,
So there's a predicament that you can get into when you do world
Switch
building
over.
if you really get into it is if you start big to small, you can literally get sucked into details that will take years to fully get to the table. So the important thing to remember when doing big is to try to keep in mind that you want to play a game at some point with this information, not perpetual, repetitive. You start in a country, that country has this kind of land formation, the rainfall and temperature is like such. They're at a war with another country, and then you're like, okay, well now I have to build that other country, and then you just basically keep building more and more onto it, and you forget that you want to have people experience this, and you're in a permanent state of under construction.
Yeah. A nice little thing here is the fact that I have a bit more experience, I think, with big to small, whereas Owlbear has a bit more experience with small to big. So I think I'll probably cover more of the big to small, and he'll cover more of the small to big.
Sounds good.
Um, so generally, big to small, there is that exact sort of issue that he was just talking about. In the first game I ever made, I wrote all of this cool stuff. I wrote the joke is that I wrote a year's worth of content in a week, um, and it's a joke only because it's 6 years in and we still haven't hit all the content. Um, so the problem is people can get way ahead of themselves. This will actually apply to both the types of world building, but always remember you don't know whether this game's going to take off. You don't know if your players are going to like this. So keep things in mind if you're going large scale that you spend the most time on whatever is happening like immediately. So with that in mind, the first thing to consider is how large is the world that these players are going to experience. Are they going to? Is this a world scaling trek where you need to make 8 different provinces that they're going to go through? In which case, you want to have more general rules about the world. You're going to need some more important points on how climate and things affect each other. Whereas if this is a province scamming, tongue tied, spanning, yes. If this is a province spanning adventure, then it's slightly smaller scale. You don't need you can make that stuff in the background, but it's not really as important. And on the other hand, if it's a galactic game, then you best put together some stuff about a group of planets, general rules about that and all that. So from there, you're going to pick into what I was talking about, which is climate. If we're doing the province, you're going to figure out things about this province. Is this a temperate region? Do they experience lots of rainfall? Good ways to think about this, if you want to be particularly brainy about it, is in general, when rain moves through an area, rain typically gets caught on mountains. So if you got a mountain, typically on one side of it, it's going to be really rainy, and on the other side, it's going to be really dry. And it's typically whichever side is facing the water, of that mountain's facing the water, that's the side that's really wet. The other side's really dry. There's plenty of cases if you look at wherever you're listening from, look at a map, look at mountain ranges, and just look at how things go. It's just a weird rule of life. So things like that are important. And from here, you're going to want to consider things like what's your level, those levels we're talking about, the level of magic and technology. How is that going to affect this? If this is a magical setting, there could be seas of, magical fire that just sit there, or mana, or, people could have cities in the sky. Then you have to consider how the climate is in the sky. You might have a sky climate. That's a bizarre concept, but you could have one. I can think of thunderstorm seas or, whatever wacky stuff, or it's an underwater adventure. So, you have your underwater cities. So basically, you're looking at building the general world in such a way that when the players go through it, you'll have stuff that you can immediately draw upon, and it will affect all of your further writing from there. So, in general, focus on build the world, build the Earth itself first.
Yeah.
You know,
Just to nail on to that,
sure.
when I do large to small world building, um, I like to just make a short list of key features from that area before I move on to the next one, so you don't get tied down in the details. Because uh, a frequent saying amongst DMs is, no plan survives contact with the enemies, and the enemies being the players.
Yep.
Players are gonna have suggestions, and they're gonna ask questions that you might not have thought about. So instead of going through your encyclopedia of the area you just designed, being able to think on the fly, because you can always do as much prep as you want for an area, and the players will be like, is there a tailor in this town? And you didn't think of what professions are there, so then you have to start going through your notes if you had thought about that. It's just important to, I find, to just keep the big things on the table, and then if people ask for more specific details, just kind of go with the flow and think on the fly.
Yeah. No, of course. This is more. I'll be honest. A lot of the sort of big down type model is it's kind of, I would say, almost masturbatory in that some of this stuff you're not going to use, but it's a good way to think about things because it's a lot of things play together. In that, if the area is temperate, and you're going to have people working in a much different way. It's going to affect culture. It's going to affect everything else. Um, I don't know. That's just the way I view it. But each their own. So from there, typically you're going to move into more stuff about the people. And by this, I mean you're going to be talking about a few major things. What are the major races of an area? What are the major cultures that exist in those races? And what are the sort of major factions? So if you're in a world where there's an evil empire that controls everything, you're going to need to write out that evil empire. You need to figure out a few basic things like what's the empire's opinion on the elves, what's the empire's opinion on the dwarves, just general broad strokes. You can move in and doodle in more details afterwards, but getting these sort of major interactions out of the way is an important one. Do elves hate dwarves? Good question. How is that going to determine things?
Yeah,
Cultures. Oh, yeah.
I'll say how racist is the world you're living in?
Oh, yeah.
Because there should always be, I find, some racial tension, because tension drives plot and story. You just don't want to go too crazy with it, but always don't be afraid to experiment with things that are considered kind of touchy in the real world, like racism.
Yeah.
But in fantasy, it's perfectly acceptable, and people enjoy it because it's drama.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And you can add all sorts of tension in that way. Through things like if you like relating back to the stuff we wrote about previously. And an example I personally have is a group of people who, in a high magic world, a group of people who don't have magic. How does that affect them? They're probably going to be a lot more racist towards people with magic. Even if if they're trying to be good with the players, it may come out every once in a while. It's a kind of fun little thing if a player harbors, if a character harbors like passive resentments, just because of the culture that they're born into. It can affect a lot of things. Moving into a no magic example again, maybe they work twice as hard because that'll show those magic users. Things like that. Draw on. I can't emphasize this enough. Draw on existing cultures. People will be disappointed if you do it too hard, but nothing works in a vacuum. And there's all these cultures exist because of huge amounts of history and trial and error, so to speak, of people interacting with each other and doing things. It's super hard to build a culture from the ground up. So yeah, draw on existing ones, meld them together, see what happens. It's fun and it's experimental. So once you have those sort of major factions and races out of the way, which of course are, once as we pointed out, it's a good thing for racism in an area, or how NPCs will interact with people, especially if one of your players is a member of one of those one of the disliked races. Then it can add all sorts of tensions there. The next sort of major factor I would say is I'm going to call them hazards, and they are monsters, gods, and I'd say technological restrictions, which is to say things that are going to take the big world you made and make it small. Because if there are monsters roaming the countryside, people can't just go out and slum with each other. People can't just go from one village to another if a monster's going to tear their head off. If the gods walk the land, that is going to affect everything. You can't have an army dedicated to, you know, saying no gods allowed and all gods are super lame if you're in a setting where the gods actually exist and take offense to that kind of stuff, because that's asking for a smiting. These are like, and in the case of technology, things like, let's just, because a lot of more futuristic technology is basically just magic at the end of the day. Let's be honest. It's just a plot device to get something done. And if your future technology runs on some special element in a region, then all of a sudden that region is going to be way more important. Everything in that region is going to be just so much more tense. People are going to fight over that region. People are going to be just doing anything they can to get that material. It could cause other situations too. What if an alternative material comes up? That can cause all sorts of tensions in and of itself. Basically, I'm just talking about factors that affect how people and cultures and everything looks at each other. And in general, you're going to want to plan these things on the most general macro level, and then pick your important ones, the important regions that people start in or that you plan on really using more than that, and then develop those. You could spend time later writing about something else in your meantime if you really, really want to and it makes you feel happy. But what you need to work on is what the players are doing, and that's the next step. Unless Albert, you got any comments on my restrictive factors?
I think it's just a matter of people's preference when it comes to restrictive factors, in particular, like with like the how you said like racism against magic uses and stuff, or how magic works in different areas, and the gods in general. Is one of the big things you have to determine is, does magic come from like elements, or is it coming from like the sources of magic? Is also, I think, important to the area.
Yeah.
Whether it comes from the elemental planes or it comes from gods, or if it's regionally specific, like this is the magic specific to the desert because that is where the desert gods live, and if you want to use any kind of desert magic, you have to be there.
Yeah.
These are all fun things you can mess around with for the sake of story.
Yeah, and those are all, once again, restricting factors in that if you let, just for your desert example, desert magic being restricted to the desert gods and the desert regions is an example of a way that restricts how people interact and how things happen. It may make desert magic an extremely rare and unique aspect. Or if someone wants to, move into a desert region, they may have to worry about desert magic.
And that the previous magic doesn't necessarily work because they're coming from the forests where they have forest magic.
Exactly. So once you have the general stuff out of the way, we're moving into our important region. So we started really big and now we're moving in smaller. So now we're going to pick, once you generally sort of figured out a few of the major places, if it's on a galactic scale, you figured out the planets. If it's on a province jumping scale, you figured out the provinces. Or what you hope to be the provinces, because once again, no plan survives the players. But from here, we're going to get into our starting region. This starting region it could be as large as an entire planet. It could be as small as a itty bitty little town. And I just saw that in the chat. Clay Sage X, this is live, and I can see you. Hello. We're going over general points that we have, but yeah, we do these every second Sunday through a Discord. There'll be a link in the description eventually. If you could post that in the chat. If you're interested at all in getting D&D tips, we regularly answer questions on the Discord. So once you have your sort of primary place, I'm just going to drop that link in the chat. Once you have your primary region that you're starting in, work a bit. Oh, yeah, already got it done. You're going to want to work on that area more. You're going to spend honestly as much time as you want on it. If you want to spend a couple of days on it, do that. If you don't. Um, but just remember that the more, while it is true that your players will bring up things that you didn't expect, and that will lead to all sorts of improvisation and creation of new things. Um, the more material you have, the more potential avenues do you have to work with regarding how the players go about things. Uh, so it's it's important to consider. Um, and I mean, honestly, I'm kind of just whiffling around on this, but the point is that from here you can pick up on general, like both sort of methods move, in my opinion, very similar ways here, which is, you know, figure out things like what's your BBG, your big bad evil guy, what's your threats, how do things kind of fit together a bit. The one of the main differences is, since we're moving from the top down, is that from here, since you've been tracing kind of how factions and stuff work together, you can fit together the story arc in a way that sets up things a lot more in advance. You're going to be, you might set up all sorts of little things that, oh, maybe this one legend is totally going to come out into an event that happens, 18 sessions down the line. But be careful about that. The more you do that, the more likely it is that you're not going to be able to use it, because your players will immediately unravel it, especially if it's a prophecy. Be careful with prophecies. There's a reason why stories make them super vague. It's because players will spite you if they think they can get away with it.
Yeah, I'd immediately follow that up with anytime you're trying to do any advanced planning for future sessions, it's like trying to predict the weather. The further in advance you try to plan something out, the less likely it is to happen, because you have the unknown variable of your players, and your players' interests will change generally as the sessions progress. That's a good thing to the better you are at herding cats, the better you are at pushing players towards plot hooks that are coming up in the future sessions. Especially if you're trying to keep the world very open and trying to stay away from railroading your players. But big to small works great for both running types, being railroading and just the regular open world Skyrim style. You start in a house and go somewhere else.
Yeah. So once you have this stuff in order, we've talked a bit previously about things like how your BBG is going to be set up and how things like that will affect the game. I could go into a bit more at some other point, but the only thing really to remember from that other stream was, if you have a major villain, like he's a warlord, a tyrant, some sort of major player, and if he's already active in your story, then just remember that he's going to affect environment, he's going to affect regions. Just keep that stuff in mind. You don't have to do a whole lot with it yet, because what you're going to focus on at the end of the day, after you've got a lot of this other stuff in order and you haven't wasted too much time making it all, you're going to get you're going to get to the sort of what I'd call the instigating story arc, which is the sort of little tale that gets the players into, from being just random adventurers who don't really know each other, to being a band of brothers, so to speak. This may not actually be connected to the rest of the story. It could be, since it's the instigating story arc. But in my personal preference is to make it a little bit less relevant, since it allows you to make something that's just kind of disconnected from the rest. And if the players are bored after you're done that, then you can throw away the rest. But maybe you want to set up something that you can then pick up with and take them on the rest of the ride, and that both ways are fine. So basically, whether this is going to be you all start in a tavern, there's a goblin attack, let's all go on to defeat the goblins, or if it's your adventurers looking for glory and the king says screw that country, let's go beat them up. Whatever it is, just remember, this is where the most of your time goes. This is where what the players experience immediately, And while you can keep all of the rest of those notes that you made in mind, this is the most important thing. Do do not let this kind of become a last minute priority. You know.
Yeah,
Um.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So from the chat, I see Clay Sage X again. How important is mapping like towns, world maps to the campaign? And do you think, especially for the story plot? So, mapping world maps and the like is as important as you make it in my book, which is to say that and this goes into the stuff that I've been talking about. If you're going from the big scale and then downwards, um, and mapping out a bunch of different towns, or at least having sort of vague ideas of it, will be a lot easier if you know the general climate. If you know that this region is deserty and mystical and all that, then when the players do get there, that's something that's just kind of out of the way for writing that part. You don't have to think about, okay, what's the climate like in this region. You can think about, this is the general feel of this area, so bada bing, bada boom.
In regards to that, I'd like to chime in a bit.
Yeah, sure.
I agree with the point that the maps are only as important as you want them to be. But from personal experience, all of my players are coming from a very high level of video game playing. So they have this expectation that D&D will be like a video game, and thus there should be a world map, or there will be some kind of reference point that they can tell where they've been and where they need to go. It varies in importance if you're doing it online over a service like Roll20, or if you're doing it at the table. Map making is probably it's easiest on paper because it's as detailed as you want it to be. But you can do more complex things with computer software, and like I said previously, we'll probably go into a stream about map making tools on the internet and guides and things like that. But I'll just use a single example that I used. Like Campaign Cartographer is a fantastic program, but it has a very high learning curve. It is not an easy program to use, but once you learn how to use it, you can make extremely beautiful maps out of it.
Yeah.
And that, as far as tying it into the story, maps are good for mapping out the story in a sense of destination points, like Mario World style, where you'll have dots on the map where there are events that you want to have or plan to have. So if you have your starting point being a dot on the map, and then you have a town away or a distance away, you can visualize it better, and it's good for planning out how long it will take for the players to travel by whatever means to that point. So it's good for setting scale in time. It's better to have a map, I find, than not having a map.
Yeah. So.
But the amount of time you have to make the map is completely dependent on the DM.
Yeah. So Albert's actually saying that in response to another response from our chat, which is Clay Sagex again saying, is it good to give them a map on what the characters know of the world, and a background map that just the DM knows? So I actually have something that I kind of wanted to add here, which is that, funny enough, I have a complete opposite sort of opinion of this, which is that all of these pictures I've been showing in this little slideshow here, just as something to have on screen, are actually stuff that, for the most part, I have used. In my game, I have maybe 2 or 3 maps that I use for like, I have like a world map, my version of the world map, which just has little doodles of, okay, they're going this way and this way and this way, and then like maybe the region that they're in, and that's it. So if they go to a town, I have a picture like this of the town, like any of these pictures that we've been cycling through, and I just sort of describe things that they're going through. And this is because the way I generally play it is that things will appear as the players need them. Of course, I haven't actually written out each individual, cobbler, candlestick maker, all of those goons, that blacksmiths, all those people. They're clearly going to be there. Unless, maybe they're not. Maybe there's something about that town that means that they would have a massive lack of candlestick makers. But in general, because I don't honestly, like, you have to remember, you have an economy of time when you're writing. If you spend too much time on writing, you will go absolutely bananas, and if you spend too little, you will be humming and hawing all the way home. So what I do is I generally, and this is also because I'm particularly good at improving out descriptions of towns and stuff. What I'll do is I'll have like a picture that inspires me to write a nice little chunk of flavor text about that town, and then after that, anything that the players ask about it, I take them on an improvised adventure through that town, and it will be entirely stuff that I've just made up on the spot. Um, Once again, it's not my particular way of doing it. It works for some people. Some people prefer to have everything planned out. But the only problem with having everything planned out on your maps is that when the players ask where this thing is, well, where is it on the map? Did you remember your candlestick maker? Did you remember the furniture guy? Hmm.
Um, I was to add to your most recent question. Um, both styles work well. It really depends, I think, on a few factors. Firstly, how much time do you have to work on the map if you want to give them that? Also, it's relative to story. Are they going to be explorers, exploring somewhere that hasn't been mapped? So that could be part of the gameplay itself, is them mapping it out. But also, it leaves a sense of wonder in the world if they don't have a fully fleshed out map, because there will be dark areas that the DM will know exists, and the DM will have planned for or intends to use in a certain way. Being able to satisfy players with that desire to uh, fulfill the sense of exploration by having the DM's map and then having the players map that they can explore and feel satisfied with learning.
That's actually a really fun one. Hadn't even. I mean, I guess I'd considered it, but not really before. That could be particularly fun in a lot of ways. But there is only one threat to that, which is if you exist in a setting where people should have logically mapped out the entire world because exploration, then if the players go out and ask for a map maker to provide them with a map, then suddenly things are a bit awkward. There are several ways around this, including having an unstable or changing world, or simply have a case of the DM being, wily, I'd call it. There are choice words that my players might use instead to refer to me, but it is effectively a situation where I look at this area and I say, well, I mean, like I use a world map to show people going through, but I really wanted an island here instead of a peninsula, so I'm just going to take my marker and just doodle in a little bit of water there and cut that off from the mainland. And I mean, as long as I do that beforehand and I establish to the players, look, this is now an island, you know, it might be right as the players are coming to that region, and suddenly things are a bit different than they initially expected. It's, as I said, it's a thing where you gotta weigh the pros and cons of it, because some players will just accuse you of kind of being a dick or
Yeah.
inconsistent.
Yeah, that's the problem with when you have a pre-made map, is second thoughts and ideas that come down the road of how you like things to change or be. You've kind of you've tied your hands. You can't really do anything unless you want to make it some world-changing event where an island rises from the depths, but then the players will immediately want to go and investigate that. So it's something you have to be prepared for.
Yeah. And to be honest, in my opinion, the best way to get around that is, since the DM plays the game as much as the players. I covered this a bit in another stream where we talked about the idea that the DM should be, that, in my opinion at least, we should demystify the DM a bit. The DM is much just someone working and trying to figure out their way in this, as the players are. So if you tell the players, look, I want to do an island thing, and the players understand that, and everybody is on board for it, and nobody like comes after you for it, then just you can break the pre-made map a bit. You can, as I said, pull out your marker, doodle on it a bit, But it's once again, it's important to that it's important that you haven't really established this beforehand. Otherwise, you're retconning stuff, and the players will be much less sympathetic towards retcons. So, it's things to keep in mind. But from here, I think we've kind of gotten into this as small as possible, which for the big to small, which is once you have your sort of instigating story arc, you just start tying things back over all the things that you've been building outwards, and it's kind of like just drawing a little line in between each one, connect the dots, and you have a campaign. The more as the players travel, all of that stuff that you've written beforehand will suddenly become more valuable as you pick it back up, reinterpret it based on the stuff you now know or the stuff you've now written, because of course you'll come up with new ideas and that'll change how things go. What may have just been an area that you thought was full of generic humans, maybe now it's full of elves because, you implied in one of your sessions in a fit of panic that it was filled with elves. So now it's filled with elves. But you know what? If it doesn't make a huge difference, then you can do it. But that's the way I view it at the very least, and that's from going big to small. From here, I think we got Owlbear to go over this, and I'm going to say in advance, I am aware that Owlbear's mic is still a little wonky.
Have I been coming in choppy?
Just a little bit. It's like maybe a consonant on the end of your word every once in a while.
I think it's either my microphone or Discord, but we'll just try to power through it.
Yeah. I don't know how honestly we might fix that, but maybe we'll figure something out at some point. But as long as it's not too bad, just let us know if it gets too bad, and I'll of course be listening, trying to fiddle with things on my end. So, you want to pick us up or set us off for going small to big?
Yeah. So with small to big planning, I find it can be much easier to develop story than if you're doing from large to small, because when you start in a smaller area, there's less variables to take into account. So if you're starting in a tavern, it's easier to plan out a tavern than it is to plan out a continent. So the amount of time you have to allocate for different things, you have a lot more time to plan out what you want to have happen, so the events, as opposed to fiddling with atmosphere, rainfall, foliage. You can plan on more who's going to be there, so it's more, you can fill more NPCs in. You can start building tension before the session starts by, okay, who's in the tavern. You have elves minding their own business, dwarves minding their own business. Where do the players come in? Or thinking a little bit bigger than a tavern, but still pretty small. If you're starting a town, if you start on a boat, regardless of what your starting location is, there will be a lot less stress on the setting, and you'll have a lot more time for the role play elements, the player interaction with each other, and developing a hook that will kind of bring the party together initially, and then something the players can go to from there. So previously in the campaign I'm currently running, my players started on a ship. They were basically conscripted, and they were being sent off to some foreign land they've never been to before. The first few sessions they had were on the ship, and it was, for the most part, an entirely role-play based session with very small amounts of combat. But you can flush out a single ship with a set amount of crewmates. You can flush that out much more easily than flushing out a giant city. I think it allows more focus on the story and the roleplay side of things, as opposed to big to small.
Yeah.
But you lose a lot of the elements of what are things they might pass as they're sailing, because you haven't planned out the oceans, or you haven't planned out any islands particularly in depth. it's also, I find it's easier when you have less time to do small to big, because you only need to have stuff ready as you need it, as opposed to basically just free writing, which is what I'd consider big to small. Is it's a free writing exercise
Oh yeah,
for D&D, as opposed to doing D&D and needing to do some free writing.
yeah. If
So
sorry,
go
if I
go
could add
ahead, go
in.
ahead.
Yeah, no. So I was thinking about this, and yeah. So the one thing that you do, the one thing I would add, you do, and I'd agree, you do miss out on a bit of these little flavor text type things that you get if you're really working a lot more on it. That things that can sometimes add to the flavor, but. What I think that one of the main things this comes down to might be a difference in temperament, to be honest, which is to say that different depending on the way you write things. Like I am very methodical about things, and I like to get into the nitty gritty of all this stuff, and I will spend an insane amount of time writing, and writing and writing and writing, which is why I actually had to limit myself to only writing 1 day a week. Otherwise, I would go a little bit bananas just with the amount of excessive writing I would do. And there are DMs who are like that. They want to get into every single little nitty gritty bit of it, and that's why those ones tend to gravitate more towards the big to small. Maybe I'm making generalizations here, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think it depends on the personality of the DM,
Yeah,
because some people are forced into DM hood, and I feel like that makes a big a big part of it is you have no DM in your group, so you have to kind of take the gauntlet and find your own entertainment in being a DM, as opposed to people that actively want to be DMs and they're just naturally more inclined towards world building. So they'd want to start from that big to small because they like manipulating and molding it. Whereas people that don't have as much desire or experience to do that kind of world shaping is the okay, baby steps. You're gonna start in the forest. You're gonna be on the road. You're doing X, Y, and Z, and there's no sense of gravitas towards the entire thing because you're not being overwhelmed by looking at empty map and being like, what is this?
yeah,
Um, it's a lot more newbie friendly, or if you're trying to build up some steam towards you start doing bigger things, is to start with the small and then kind of get yourself hooked on it. Because it's like, okay, I start in the forest and they're traveling somewhere, and then as you start to be like, okay, who are they traveling with? And then you can go into, okay, where are they going? Where are they coming from? What are they doing? And then it kind of like it's like you drop a pebble in a puddle, and now like it's just creating waves in every direction. So then you're gonna go, okay, what could be in the forest? What are some hazards that I could introduce to the party? Um, how do I want the atmosphere? Like, is everybody is a traveling refugees? Everybody's beaten and worn, and then you can build yourself from there by starting from that one. We start the forest. You can get to what's shaping around you. So you kind of it's a good way I find to build up steam for when you're writing. Is you start small and then you get yourself interested in writing what you want to hear.
yeah, yeah. I can definitely see it, and it definitely after hearing a lot more about it, I would definitely say that it does sound like a temperament difference because if I had to go that way, I would be going bananas with the idea that I haven't planned out all the methodical little things around it. But that's another reason why I do things like GOPD because it gives me a break from, being excessively analytical because sometimes that's not good. So I mean, from there with small to big, where exactly do you go?
Well, you go in the way that I think comes to the DM is knowing your players. If like they're friends of yours, or if you're going to be hosting like hosting people that you aren't as familiar with, is having a bit more material needed than you think you're going to need. Um, because you don't know the sense of how your players are going to react, and using the first few sessions, including your session zero, to figure out uh, the pace and how much you should be preparing will really depend on how you think your players are going to act and how you can keep them entertained in an area long enough for you to have the next area kind of prepped. because, like I said, it's a lot of player management and time management when you're doing small to big. So I assume that if you're doing small to big, you have a pretty busy schedule, and you don't have hours and hours to do all this writing. I find that it's basically whatever is if you whatever you can read from your players will be infinitely more useful when determining how much time to allocate to this kind of building method, or if you're on like a hiatus from playing, kind of going with that.
Yeah. Um, so actually, from there, there is. I'd like to kind of move towards the our sort of last thoughts. Um, if that's unless you have anything more to add.
No, I think
Yeah.
that's we're gone over it.
Okay. So because there's actually a very that leads very well into where I wanted to go with my last thoughts, which is that there is one sort of rule that looms over all of this, like any sort of world building that you do, and that is the we kind of mentioned the idea before that no plan survives the players, and this rule's kind of a variation in that, which is that if whatever the players show interest in, that's the story. And what I mean by this is there are all sorts of tales of this that you can find around where a DM crafts some sort of amazing little beautiful gem of a story, and the players derail it by going off on some random adventure into who knows what. They pick up a random NPC, and this NPC is their life. They are so interested in him, in his tale, in his, you know, traumas and everything, and nothing else matters anywhere near as much as that. So, some DMs will try to move players back into their story, and I honestly understand the desire to do that, but this is where we get into what people call railroading. When people refer to railroading, some DMs will think that it's just forcing the players to do anything against their will, quote unquote. But I would honestly disagree with that, because anytime you write a story, you're forcing the players into wherever you want to go. But the idea is to make it attractive to them. If the players are attracted to something else and you force them to do your thing, that's railroading.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the illusion of free will when you have players and you make it seem like it's a very open world, but using your instinct as a storyteller and as a writer and as a narrator is you're gonna if you know your players at all, you know what's gonna stick and what's gonna kind of get them interested. So it's railroading for in a way because you can anticipate what your players will get hooked on. For example, just a small little side here. For example, in one of my games, um, some of my players were entering a town. They had to pay a toll to get in, and then proceed with their quest. But instead of proceeding with their quest, they took a personal vendetta against the guard that charged them the toll to get in. Um, and knowing that some people like play very murder hobo games, you kind of have to anticipate that if you ever have an NPC slight a player, you need to be prepared for imminent repercussions.
yeah,
So it's always good to kind of keep in mind the kind of players you have.
of course. And there's one way though that this can go further, which is that if your players decide that something else is the story, as I said, if they're more interested in something else, then that's the story. There is actually a place where this can go, which is even further. There's an old green text, a 4chan story somewhere on that floats around the internet, where it talks about some guy. He was, making stereotypical, heroes destroying the big bad evil lich who wants to summon dark forces or whatever. And instead, the players hear that gay marriage is not allowed in the kingdom, so they turn it into a political adventure about instituting gay marriage. Um, so the story ends with the DM bringing out the forces of darkness, who rose because nobody stopped them, and killing all the players. Now, whether or not you think that it's right to destroy the players at the end of your game because they didn't deal with the forces of darkness, the truth is that at the end of the day, you're both playing a game, and you both need to have fun. if the players are way too into this one little bit, you can always try to integrate it into the plot, but sometimes they are just way too into something that to the point where it completely invalidates the rest of the campaign. And at some point, you may just have to put away everything else you've written and pick up a new story entirely. If the players have decided, I jokingly said earlier, that if the players decide that they want more than anything else, what they want more than anything else is to start a winery, and they want to grow grapes and make wines and sell it to all the NPCs, and that is they want more than anything else. And screw fighting liches and monsters. They want to grow wine. Then you best put away those liches. You best put away all those monsters and pull out your wine growing manual, because that's the new world. So, Owlbear made this really nice little statement, which was that you render the world around the players, and I really like that. And it is super important. But I'd say also render the world, I'd focus that in a little more, which is to say render the world around the players' interests. If that makes sense.
I get what you're saying, but I'd also just kind of add, there's kind of a shared expectation between dungeon masters and players, and if the players know that something is going on and they choose to ignore it, then I think that for the sake of keeping the world dynamic, things will happen whether the players are there or not. And if that means a person runs up to the players and says, help, my village is going to be destroyed if nobody does anything, they proceed to do nothing, then there are going to be natural consequences. Not that it's the players' fault if they're not interested, but it makes the world more interesting for the players to know that things happen while they're not paying attention and while they're not interacting with things. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. So if they want to go play Tropico and create a vineyard, things can show up that will threaten their vineyard because they didn't nip them in the bud when they had the opportunity or the chance, and that's just good storytelling.
I of course agree completely. However, I would also argue that if you did have an apocalypse clock, so to speak, on hand beforehand, and the players have completely rededicated themselves to, using the vineyard analogy, if they're continuing to just focus on their entire efforts on wine growing and they have not leveled anything else up, and you had an apocalypse clock ticking in the background before the evil dark god gets summoned and everything gets destroyed, you might have to change the tone to a situation where if the dark evil god is going to come, he may be the player's final challenge, and the players may have to seduce him with the perfect experience of going through a winery and having a great time with wine and cheese tasting, and he eventually decides maybe this world isn't worth destroying if he can get such fine vintages, and he goes on his merry way. Some DMs may agree with it, some DMs may not. I don't know. That's my view on it. What do you think?
I'm gonna just disagree and say if the players want to do their own thing, they are absolutely free to do it, but that doesn't make them free from consequences. So if they want to run the vineyard, coincidentally, they're not allowed to whine about it later when it gets destroyed because the apocalypse came.
Okay.
That they knew about, at least.
Yeah, no, it's fair. It's different ways of GMing. I'm gonna say that neither way, whether you take more from Owlbear's side or mine, on this issue, on this thing, it's a matter of perspective. I think that both perspectives are valuable in it, and I honestly don't know which one is right, or if there even is a right perspective. But I will say that make your own opinions based on what we've given.
It's a matter of play style and knowing your players.
Yeah,
I think those are probably the two biggest things in any kind of world building: is know your players and know what you want. Because if it's only fun for the players but not fun for the DM, then you're doing something wrong, because it should be fun for everyone involved.
I completely agree. So even if the players do decide to take things in their own direction, then then if you decide to do things in your own in a different direction with the players, then make sure that everybody's having fun with it. Don't just completely bend the knee to the players, and don't let the players completely bend the knee to you. From our comments, we have Clay Sage X saying that you should talk about what you plan with the campaign with the players before you start the campaign. And yeah, no, that's we've talked about this before. You should 100% communicate.
Yeah. I mean, don't tell them the story, but you should definitely agree to terms. Like when you're talking to your players about the game you want to play, you approach them with the idea, like, "Hey, I want to play a high fantasy hack and slash, live fast, die hard kind of story." And if your players are like, "No, I wanna grow grapes and make wine," then there either needs to be some kind of compromise where you can have the Fast and Furious, only it's Fast and the Alcoholic, or you just need to readjust your expectations, find the happy medium, or that might just not be the group of players for your story.
Yeah, of course. So, with all that in mind, I'm going to leave this. I think we should call it here. We've run long enough. This is all stuff. Once again, it's up to the listener to decide what they think about it. Leave comments if you guys have your own opinions on it, your own takes. I do read the comments. I try and get as much out of it as possible. But if you really want to get your more specific answers to your questions or queries, we have a Discord. It should be linked to it in the description, along with our link to the Twitch where we do the stream. We might be switching over to recorded videos from here on, since it might be a little easier with scheduling the way it is. Either way, though, we are most active on our Discord, so feel free to come by for that. Even if we do pre-recorded, we will still be doing Hydra's Den GOPD. So, look forward to that once I get out of my massive piles of work. And
other social media to be announced. I know there is a Twitter that will be being activated soon.
It is actually
setting
active.
up. It is active.
It is active. I just don't use it.
There will be twits and there will be tweets, and I'm currently working on a Pinterest as a resource bank for the community.
Yeah.
We do have a lovely resource bank on the Discord, but it can get kind of filled up and you can lose track of stuff. So there will be a more organized system that you can come and look at and grab what you need and suggest what you want to see.
Yeah. So once again, you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to leave comments. Please join us on the Discord, like and subscribe, all that. I've been your host, Hydra.
I have been Owlbear.
Yeah, and have a good night.